The Commanders made a massive trade yesterday to try to boost their secondary. Let's start there. What'd you make of the Lattimore move?
I think it's great. I think I said this before on the show, the defensive improvements the team has made over the past couple of weeks is significant. And to be able to bring in Lattimore, especially his press coverage, I think is going to be an asset for this team. I've said it before, this organization from top to bottom deserves the benefit of the doubt. I know there's a lot of people that were talking about how poorly Lattimore perhaps has been playing this year. But I also see that it's very difficult to throw to his side of the field. And I think that's not something Washington has had lately. So I think it's a great move for them. The picks they gave up were second-day picks for a team that might win 10 games this season. Some of them weren't even their own. I think it's a great move and probably just keeps the defense improving to keep pace with this offense that we've talked about that's been historically efficient as of late.
When you look specifically at the compensation, I think you brought some interesting stuff up there. Like they gave up their third rounder, not the one they have coming from the Dolphins. That's a significantly higher pick. The fourth and then getting the fifth back. By the time this thing finishes, you're probably talking about a delta of like maybe 14 draft spots. You know what I mean? Between Washington having a late fourth and New Orleans will have an early fifth. Specific to the compensation, I'm sure you ran numbers and models on it. Did it seem pretty fair? Did it seem like a square deal, or did one side win?
No, I think it's fine. Obviously, you don't get a player like Lattimore for this type of value if there aren't some issues with the player, right? Like if he's still the Pro Bowl player that we remember for a couple of years ago, obviously his price is a lot more expensive. But I truly do think that bringing him in for this price, what it does for the defense, being able to move back players to maybe a more comfortable position in the secondary. Lattimore's a guy that can patrol one side of the field. He can improve a defense. And I think the upside more than outweighs any downside, especially financially. I think the trade is fine in terms of the assets given, but I do think that Washington has a chance to make this look like a very lopsided trade in their favor.
Yeah, and do you think that this the complexion of this trade, or it looks different because of how Washington's been doing early in the season? Obviously 7-2. You mentioned how that affects the draft capital and the assets they're moving, but it also kind of, I'm sure, informs some positivity around the league in terms of the direction the team's headed.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really had a chance to talk to the command. Usually the Commanders are the one giving the Lattimore type player away, right? We got this from Adam Schefter a couple of days ago that Washington was starting to be a destination. Read into that what you will, but I think that you do have to look at it as the value that Washington gives up in draft assets. They are a better team, so they're not, we're not talking about day one picks, in the first half of the draft. I do believe from an X's and O's standpoint, there's hidden value there because, and you know this way better than me, Logan, is, if you have players that maybe are not in their most ideal position, that's going to bring the entire unit down. But if you can make one shift for a player, the rookie going from outside to inside, and then having Lattimore on the outside, that could significantly change the defense. And, the secondary has been a challenge with this team, dating back to last year. So I think that, it has a chance to be a very good trade. And, this is the type of trade Washington should be making in the position that they're in, right? They're not tinkering with the offense that's running really great. They have a defensive-minded coach, a defense that's improving. Obviously, everyone, that follows this team knows there's a challenge in the secondary. They address that part of it in a very meaningful and conservative way. I think that it's a very high-leverage, low-risk transaction that Washington was really smart to make.
And when looking at the trade, obviously, Marshon Lattimore plays corner. And like when you look at corners that change schemes, obviously there's a certain level of variance that's seemingly a little bit higher with that position than other positions. Does that inform your perspective on this trade at all?
It used to. But what I found is that, especially with I found that, the defensive coordinators, offensive coordinators, coaches, et cetera, they know this too, right? Like they know what it takes to onboard a player. And I think with a guy like Lattimore, who's a 4-time Pro Bowl, you're not teaching him how to play the position. You maybe just getting him up to speed on what your packages are, maybe what your vernacular is. But the onboarding curve there should be relatively short. I mean, you're basically telling him to go out there. This is your part of the field. Don't give up any big plays, which he's, probably pretty good at because, for the most part, quarterbacks aren't throwing to his side of the field. I saw one stat where, the completion rates for catches against him were high, but the frequency of those targets were very low. So I think it'll be fine. I mean, there's plenty of tape, to know where his strengths and weaknesses are. And, I think just from an information standpoint, the NFL coaching staffs as a whole are much better at, absorbing information, getting information, distilling information, and then really drilling down on what's important and focusing on that early in the process, at least from the coaches and analytics people that I've talked to.
Talking with our friend Neil Greenberg here from the Washington Post. Stats, analytics, fantasy, gambling. He does it all. Greenberg, every week you piss people off with your power rankings. I want to give you the floor here. Where you got Washington now?
I have them tied for 7th with the Minnesota Vikings. I have them as 3.5 point favorite, 3.5 points better than an average team. The teams ahead of them: Detroit, Baltimore, Kansas City, Buffalo, Philadelphia, San Francisco. I think if we would have had this conversation before the season started, saying that around the halfway mark they'd be kind of in that mix of teams, or those would be the only teams that are considered better, or even a handful of teams. I think we would have thought I was a little bit silly. But again, I mean, offense working out great. Jaden Daniels obviously is showing that he could be the guy, and the defense is improving and they're winning games. And I think the biggest thing is they're not making mistakes that maybe we've seen in the past, especially turnovers that cost them games. I mean, they're taking care of the football, they're moving the football, they're scoring when they have the opportunities, and now the defense is playing better. I mean, that's the whole package. And I actually tweeted this out the other day. Like, I have them solidly in like the 3rd tier of teams behind Detroit and Baltimore. And then like the 2nd tier is like Kansas City, Buffalo, Philadelphia, San Francisco. But then Washington's in that 3rd tier, which I consider to be at the very least a threat to win the conference. It's pretty remarkable for a team that had an over-under win total of 6.5 games.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and like when you look at Washington's strength of schedule, does that factor in at all to that power ranking, or do you just say, hey, wins are wins and the offense, defense look good?
It does. It does adjust for who you play and who they played and all that. You can only play who's put in front of you, right? I mean, they've had a relatively easy schedule, in hindsight, right? Like they've played the Giants, they've played the Browns, who aren't very good. The Panthers aren't very good. The Bears aren't very good. So they've have win against teams that are not considered to be very good. But when you beat a not very good team by 40-7, you're showing that you too are very, like at some point you have to take that into account also. Cleveland 34-13, Arizona 42-14. Those are lopsided victories, and that's going to factor into it as well. They certainly have some big games coming up. This one with Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, 2 versus Dallas, Atlanta. I mean, there are certainly teams that are going to test them, but their first objective obviously is to play the teams that are put in front of them. And right now, they've done everything you've asked, and even the team a really good team, the Baltimore Ravens, they only lost by 7 points, which, I think also shows how far Washington has come this season.
Real quick, because if you have them top 10, you got them at 7, tied with the Vikings. I might move them ahead of the Vikings. That defense is incredible. I can't buy Sam Darnold. You saw it the other night in Sunday Night Football. The turnovers started to pop up. Do I recall correctly, Neil, talking with our friend Neil Greenberg, Washington Post Analytics, didn't you advise or at least offer an alt win total line for Washington? Didn't you get them
9.5. It was like plus 250 at one point.
Yeah. Did you end up hitting that?
Yeah, of course. I don't advocate a bet that I wouldn't myself be willing to make. But again, you look at
touts.
You look at these things like that were in their favor, and the floor was set so low, and it's hard to win less than 4 games in the NFL, right? And I'm saying this like a broad stroke here, but you look at some of the worst teams in NFL history. We've only had a couple go 0 for the season. But usually the poor teams win, 3 or 4 games because of the parity in the NFL. So to set the win total at 6.5, the downside was pretty low, and there was just so much uncertainty. It didn't make any sense to look at anything but an optimistic turnout. And I would also include, them winning the division, winning the NFC, and even some Super Bowl futures as well. I think I have. I definitely have them to win the division. I'd have to look at what prices, and also some to win the conference. Because that's how you make smart bets, right? Like you look at stuff that the market cannot price. Like you cannot price in or with any level of confidence the uncertainty between new ownership, new front office, new coaching staff, rookie quarterback, like all that stuff. Like it's just impossible. But I do know that there was a greater than 0 chance that it works out really well. And, obviously I'll be rewarded for that.
But doesn't uncertainty usually lead to kind of dysfunction and disruption? So you're just kind of betting against that completely, sounds like.
Well, I'm just betting that the markets can't efficiently price what we call the tails, right? Like the extreme outcomes. And, when you have a 6.5 win total, like the extreme outcome would have been like 3 wins. But because the win total was so low, and because everyone thinks that Washington was supposed to be bad, there just wasn't any value there. But I would argue like the chance for them to go, let's say like 2-15 is probably the same for them to win, 10, 11, 12 games. But the price difference between the two was just, it was enormous, to the point where your edge on the optimistic side was just so much bigger. And I'm not saying this to say, well, I knew they had a 33% chance to win 10 or more games. Like, I just knew the markets couldn't price it right. And I knew that directionally speaking, I was correct. And I had an edge in that market of some number. I couldn't tell you with any specifics what the number was, but I knew for certain with all the uncertainty that it could not possibly be priced correctly.
Greenberg, I do want to bring one other thing up. Remiss if I didn't. Ovechkin, no, nothing bad.
Okay, good.
Alex Ovechkin on fire to start the year. The Caps on fire to start the year. How good is this team? And you think Ovi could take down the record this year?
Yeah, I think he could take it down like next week if he wanted to. I think the team is good. We talked about strength of schedule earlier. That's certainly something being brought up with them. But Dylan Strome, obviously is doing his thing. 4 goals, 13 assists. Ovechkin, Connor McMichael. They have contributions from the older guys and the younger guys. Everything seems to be working for Ovechkin. Whenever he's been on like this type of pace, he's usually in the 40 to 50 goal mark by the end of the season. If he makes it there, he's got a real good chance of passing Gretzky at some point. I actually think it happens earlier rather than later. I'll probably have something coming out in the next week or two as to when I think the actual record will fall based on who they're playing and all that type of stuff. It would not surprise me to see it though, like late February, early March. Like I think that's a real possibility that we could be talking about depending on health and et cetera. But, based on what we're seeing right now, yes, I do think it falls. And I think that if you want to see it, you may want to start looking at the games that are like early March against like Tampa Bay, Ottawa, Detroit, Seattle, because I think it really could happen during one of those games.
That's wild, man. That'll be so cool when that goes.
It's wild how good he is relative to expectations, how good he's been, but also he's been here the whole time, right? Like that to me is perhaps the biggest testament to his legacy in Washington. Is he could have gone anywhere that he wanted to go, like anywhere he wanted to go on the planet. But he's been a staple of Washington throughout his whole career. And it's just one of my favorite sports storylines of all time, seeing a homegrown talent live up to expectations as a generational talent. And here we are talking about the Gretzky record. It's just a phenomenal story from beginning to end.